The snow fell like it had orders. It didn't just cover the Ardennes, it muted it, hid it, and turned the forest into a weapon the way darkness turns a knife into a surprise. In the early hours of December 16, 1944, German artillery slammed into American positions, ripping apart phone lines and any illusion that this sector of the front was quiet. The Germans were gambling everything on speed. They needed to punch through Belgium and Luxembourg, cross the Meuse, and seize the harbor at Antwerp before the Allies could regroup and bring their superior air power down on them. For that to happen, German mechanized forces had to own the roads. And in the Ardennes, roads weren't conveniences, they were destiny. All 7 main roads in the region converged on one place, Bastogne. If Bastogne fell, the German offensive could breathe and run. If Bastogne held, the offensive would choke. The Germans expected the crossroads town to collapse quickly under the weight of tanks and infantry. They expected the Americans there to be too late, too cold, too outnumbered, too cut off. They expected a surrounded force to do what surrounded forces are supposed to do in winter war: break. What they didn't expect was that the 101st Airborne Division, rushed into place with barely enough time to dig in, would turn that crossroads into a fortress, answer a surrender demand with nuts, and hold long enough for Patton's tanks to carve a corridor through the storm. German forces surrounded the 101st and learned the hard way that surrounding Americans does not always mean beating them. By December 1944, the Allies had been advancing for months. Normandy had cracked open France, and the Allied front line now stretched from Nijmegen in the north down to neutral Switzerland in the south, a long, strained arc that looked victorious but was vulnerable in places. Antwerp, the port the Germans wanted most, had been captured during the push, and by winter the Allies even held German territory near Aachen. For the Germans, defeat was approaching like a closing door. Adolf Hitler decided to try to slam that door back open with a shock attack that would split the Allied line and force a political crisis. He ordered a surprise offensive through the Ardennes, committing 25 divisions to a drive that was supposed to cross the Meuse and recapture Antwerp. His senior commanders, men like Rundstedt and Model, had major misgivings, but the plan was not significantly modified, and the attack date was set for December 16. The Germans counted on surprise, on weather, on the Allies believing the Ardennes was unsuitable for a major attack, and on thin American defenses collapsing fast enough that the German columns could keep moving. They were racing not only Allied troops, but Allied aircraft. If the skies cleared and the Allies could fly freely, German armored columns would be mauled. The weather was Germany's cloak, but that cloak would not last forever. The Allies did not expect a major attack there. Terrain was the main reason: dense woods, narrow roads, and difficult ground that seemed to limit the movement of large armored formations. Intelligence reports suggested German divisions in the area were tired. The American unit defending the region around Bastogne was mainly the 28th Infantry Division, which had already endured continuous fighting from July to November, including the brutal Battle of Huichen Forest, and had been shifted to this sector precisely because it was considered comparatively calm. The Allies believed only an infantry division faced them across the line, and they expected any attack there to be limited. That misjudgment did not come from stupidity, it came from pattern. The Germans were battered. The Ardennes looked unlikely. But war punishes assumptions, and in this case, the assumption gave Hitler his opening. On the German side, Bastogne was never an afterthought. It was the key to the road network. Hassel von Manteuffel, commanding the 5th Panzer Army, assigned Heinrich Freiherr von Leutwitz's XLVII Panzer Corps the task of taking Bastogne before pushing on toward the Meuse near Namur. Leutwitz planned to attack across a 7-mile front with 3 divisions, the 26th Volksgrenadier and 2nd Panzer Division leading, with the elite Panzer Lehr Division behind them. On the American side, the defense was dangerously thin along the Our River, which marks the border between Germany and Luxembourg. 2 battalions of the 110th Infantry Regiment were responsible for a 9-mile front, with the 3rd held back as a reserve. Outposts along the river were even manned only in daytime in places. It was too thin to be a solid line, so the defenders focused on the handful of roads crossing the river. Heavy rain before the German attack meant only one northern road was in good enough condition for major movement, the road crossing at Dasburg toward Clervaux and Bastogne. The Germans assigned the 2nd Panzer Division to cross there, while engineers of the 26th Volksgrenadier would build a bridge farther south near Gemund. Leutwitz knew the truth about Ardennes warfare. You can't roam, you must funnel, and you must take the funnels. He ordered Panzerlehr to push toward Bastogne as soon as his forces crossed the Clerve River in Luxembourg. Bastogne had to be captured before the Corps ventured too far west, because the crossroads would control everything that followed. The German attack began before dawn. On the evening of December 15, German troops established outposts along the west bank of the Our in routine fashion, a cover for what was coming. At 03:00 engineers began ferrying men and equipment over the river, assembling close to American garrisons. At 05:30, artillery began pounding American positions, knocking out phone lines as infantry advanced. The Germans attacked swiftly with overwhelming numbers. In places like Weiler, one American company supported by mortars and anti-tank guns held until nightfall against repeated attacks. Engineers completed bridges, armor rolled forward, and the sheer weight of German forces began to crush the thin defense. But the Americans did something crucial even as they were overwhelmed. They delayed the Germans. German plans to cross the Clerve River by nightfall on the first day were delayed by 3 days. That delay is one of the hidden reasons Bastogne became possible. The siege legend begins not with the 101st, but with worn infantrymen along a river line who refused to collapse instantly and made the Germans pay for every mile. By December 19, the 28th Division command post moved to Bastogne from Wiltz. At Wiltz, the division made its last stand, with the 3rd Battalion of the 110th supported by armor and artillery arriving around noon. The 44th Engineer Battalion tried to hold north of town, but was overwhelmed and retreated, blowing a bridge behind them. This small force of about 500 held until evening before retreating west. The 110th Infantry was essentially destroyed as a combat unit. But it had bought time, and time in this crisis was everything, because the Ardennes offensive achieved virtually complete surprise, and by the end of the 2nd day it was clear the 28th Infantry was near collapse. Bastogne was now a target that could decide the offensive, and the Allies had to react fast or lose the road hub that would let German armor run. The reaction was immediate and desperate. Major General Troy Middleton of VII Corps received Combat Command B of the 10th Armored Division as reinforcement for Bastogne, a combined arms package including the 3rd Tank Battalion, armored infantry, tank destroyers, artillery, and support troops. Patton was not happy about giving it up because he was preparing his own offensive, but Bradley ordered it released. Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, ordered the SHAEF Reserve forward, the 82nd Airborne Division and the 101st Airborne Division, both veteran formations resting and rebuilding after Market Garden. The alert came on the evening of December 17, and because transport wasn't automatically assigned, these divisions had to scramble for trucks. The 82nd, longer in reserve and better re-equipped, moved first to Werbemont to block the dangerous advance of Kampfgruppe Paper on the northern shoulder. The 101st left Camp Mermelin on the afternoon of December 18 in a long convoy, moving at night through drizzle and sleet, headlights on despite the risk, because speed mattered more than caution. At one point the column stretched roughly 75 miles. The 101st had originally been destined for Werbemont too, but it was rerouted to Bastogne, 107 miles away on a high plateau, because Bastogne could not be allowed to fall. The 101st arrived fast. The first elements of the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment entered the assembly area west of Bastogne shortly after midnight on December 19, and by 09:00 the entire division had arrived. They came without tanks of their own, because airborne divisions were light. They came into a situation where German armor was already in the region, and the roads were threatened. McAuliffe, acting commander, sent the 501st southeast through Bastogne at 06:00 to develop the situation. By 09:00 it deployed along the highway to Magret and Longville, where Panzerlehr was fighting to destroy the delaying armor infantry teams the Americans had thrown forward. The 506th moved soon after, its 1st Battalion sent north to Naval to reinforce Team de Sabri from CCB, while the other battalions became reserves. The 502nd marched north and northwest to establish a line. The 327th Glider Infantry Regiment protected the division service area southwest of town. The 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion, in reserve to the north, was ordered to Bastogne to provide anti-tank support and arrived late on December 19. In hours, Bastogne went from a vulnerable crossroads to a defended hub, and the Germans arrived to find something they did not expect: Americans in position, and Americans willing to hold in place rather than retreat west. The fighting at Naval on December 19 and 20 became one of the pivotal delays that set the stage for the siege. The 1st Battalion of the 506th supported Team de Sabri, a battalion-sized tank infantry task force from the 10th Armored Division, assigned to defend the village northeast of Bastogne. With just 4 M18 Hellcat tank destroyers from the 705th to assist, the paratroopers fought units of the 2nd Panzer Division, which was trying to move via secondary roads to seize key highways and fuel dumps. The Germans needed fuel. Their entire offensive would falter without it. The Americans at Naval destroyed tanks and inflicted heavy casualties in what amounted to a spoiling fight, and the losses, especially from the tank destroyers, deceived the German commander into thinking Naval was held by a much stronger force. Seeking tactical advantage, he recoiled and delayed rather than driving through. That delay was not a footnote. It was a strategic mistake for a German plan that depended on speed, and it gave the 101st time to organize defenses around Bastogne. After 2 days, the 2nd Panzer finally continued toward the Meuse, but its involvement around Bastogne had consequences. It failed to dislodge the airborne forces, lost time, and later ran out of fuel and was destroyed near Celles by Allied armor. Naval also came at a price. The 1st Battalion of the 506th fought its way back through Foy after Foy was taken, and by the time it reached American lines, it had lost 13 officers and 199 enlisted men out of about 600. Team de Sabri lost a quarter of its troops and was reduced to just 4 medium tanks. This was not a clean victory. It was a delay purchased in blood, and it mattered. By December 20, German forces surrounded Bastogne and isolated it. The siege was on. The 101st formed an all-round perimeter. The 502nd blocked the northwest shoulder against the 26th Volksgrenadier. The 506th blocked approaches from Naval. The 501st defended the eastern approach, and the 327th Glider Infantry stretched along the southern perimeter from Marvy in the southeast to Champs in the west, with engineers and artillery plugging gaps. The division service area west of Bastogne was raided early, and the division lost almost its entire medical company, forcing service troops into infantry roles to reinforce thin lines. Combat Command B, weakened by its delaying fights, formed a mobile fire brigade of about 40 light and medium tanks, including survivors from other units and replacement tanks found unassigned in Bastogne. 3 artillery battalions were commandeered into a temporary group, each with 12 155 howitzers, giving the defenders heavy firepower in all directions, limited only by ammunition. Colonel Roberts also gathered more than 600 stragglers from the rout of VII Corps and formed Team Snafu as a stopgap. Bastogne was not held by one pristine unit. It was held by a patchwork made lethal through coordination. The Germans cut all 7 highways leading to Bastogne by noon on December 21. The Americans were outnumbered roughly 5-1. They lacked cold weather gear, ammunition, food, medical supplies, and senior leadership. Major General Maxwell Taylor was away, leaving McAuliffe in command. The weather was the worst winter in memory, and it grounded Allied aircraft. Until December 23, the skies prevented resupply drops and tactical air support. That mattered because American doctrine and American advantage depended heavily on air power. The Germans had planned their offensive around this. They wanted to win before the Allies could fly. In those days, Bastogne was isolated not only by German forces but by cloud and snow. The defenders had to hold without the sky, and that is one reason the siege became such a moral symbol. The Americans inside knew they were cut off. They knew the Germans believed they were trapped, and still they held. The way they held was not just stubbornness. It was tactical intelligence aided by geography. Bastogne's defenders had interior lines. German assaults came from multiple directions, often uncoordinated, probing points of the southern and western perimeter in sequence, rather than crashing in as one overwhelming mass attack. That played into the American advantage. The defenders could shift artillery fire quickly and move their limited armored forces to meet each successive assault. Anti-aircraft guns were dragged into the front line to fire at enemy armor, augmenting the 57 anti-tank guns. Artillery was used in direct fire against tanks, with over 2,000 rounds expended in that role on December 20. Tank destroyers and tanks moved rapidly to threatened sectors. The defense became a layered system. Anti-aircraft and anti-tank weapons slowed German armor at maximum range, buying time for mobile tank and tank destroyer units to arrive and finish the attack. Time and again, that technique broke German thrusts. The Germans had strength, but they did not apply it in a way that could crush the pocket quickly, and time was the one thing they could not afford to spend. As a result of the powerful American defense north and east, von Leutwitz decided to encircle Bastogne and strike from the south and southwest, starting the night of December 2021. German reconnaissance units nearly overran American artillery positions southwest of town, but were stopped by a makeshift force. The pocket tightened. The siege hardened. And on December 22, the Germans tried to end it with a surrender demand. Leutwitz sent a note to McAuliffe claiming the fortune of war was changing, that Bastogne was encircled by strong armored units, and that the only possibility to save the Americans from annihilation was honorable surrender. The note threatened immediate artillery destruction and invoked civilian losses as a moral pressure point. It offered 2 hours to think it over, as if the Americans were already beaten and needed only to accept reality. McAuliffe's reply became one of the most famous one-word messages in military history. Nuts. The German truce party did not understand the phrase, and an American officer translated it bluntly as "go to hell." In that exchange, the Germans learned something they did not expect. The Americans in Bastogne were not thinking like victims. They were thinking like defenders who believed time was on their side because relief would come, and they were determined to make the Germans pay until it did. The surrender demand did not stop the attacks. Christmas Eve brought reinforcement to the German infantry, and that night Luftwaffe bombers struck Bastogne, killing 21 in an aid station, an ugly reminder of how war punishes the wounded. On Christmas Day, the Germans launched a concentrated assault on the west side of the perimeter. 18 tanks carrying a battalion of infantry pierced the lines of the Glider Infantry Battalion holding that sector and advanced deep enough to threaten command posts at Hemrel. For a moment, it looked like the kind of break that could turn a pocket into chaos, but the defense held. The 327th retained its original positions and repulsed follow-on infantry assaults, capturing prisoners. The panzers that penetrated split into columns, one trying to reach Champs from the rear. They were destroyed in detail by American infantry and tank destroyers, two companies of the 502nd under Lt. Col. Patrick Cassidy, and four tank destroyers of the 705th. That pattern repeated throughout the siege. German armor achieved local penetration, then was cut off and destroyed because the defenders could shift forces across interior lines while the attackers were stretched along the perimeter. The weather broke on December 23, and the siege's balance began to change. When the skies cleared enough for aircraft, resupply became possible. More importantly, it restored the threat of Allied air power, which the Germans feared. Bastogne's defenders could finally receive ammunition, food, medical supplies, and winter gear. That resupply was not just physical, it was psychological proof that the pocket was not abandoned. In siege warfare, belief is fuel. A surrounded force that believes relief is coming fights differently than one that believes it has been forgotten. The Germans needed Bastogne to fall before the Allied air advantage returned. Once it didn't, the German clock began to run out. Relief arrived on December 26. Patton's Third Army, driving from the south and southwest, sent a spearhead toward Bastogne. The 4th Armored Division's lead elements broke through near Assenois, and the first tank to make contact, often remembered as Cobra King, reached the lines of the 326th Engineers at approximately 1650. A corridor opened. Ground communications were restored the next day. Wounded were evacuated. Maxwell Taylor returned and resumed command. The fighting around Bastogne would continue for weeks, but the siege period was over. The Germans had failed to crush the pocket in time. The Americans had held the crossroads, and that mattered not only to Bastogne but to the entire Battle of the Bulge. Allied morale rose across the front as news spread that the surrounded town had not surrendered, that it had defied the enemy, and that relief had broken through. The cost was enormous. The 101st Airborne suffered hundreds killed, thousands wounded, and hundreds missing between December 19 and January 6. Units earned the grim nickname, the Battered Bastards of Bastogne. The division's headquarters received a Presidential Unit Citation for the defense, and the Belgian Army awarded honors as well. Combat Command B of the 10th Armored Division incurred about 500 casualties and also earned a Presidential Unit Citation, though even years later McAuliffe believed CCB was never properly credited for its decisive role. Bastogne was not simply an airborne fairy tale. It was a combined arms defense. Airborne infantry, glider infantry, tank destroyers, armored combat commands, engineers, artillery, anti-aircraft guns used against tanks, and even improvised formations of stragglers, all coordinated to hold a perimeter under siege. Civilians suffered too, and individuals like Nurse Augusta Chaiwi, who aided the wounded, became part of the human story that makes Bastogne more than a map symbol. So why didn't the Germans expect America to stand? Because their offensive depended on shock and collapse. It depended on Allied commanders being surprised long enough for German speed to become unstoppable. It depended on a crossroads falling quickly so armored columns could keep moving. It depended on the weather grounding Allied aircraft long enough to protect the offensive. And it depended on the psychology of encirclement, on the belief that a surrounded force, cold and hungry, will surrender when threatened with annihilation. Bastogne broke that logic. It proved the Allies could absorb surprise without shattering. It proved that even a light division, when reinforced with tanks and tank destroyers and backed by coordinated artillery, could defeat heavier forces committed in uncoordinated thrusts. It proved the value of interior lines, rapid shifting of firepower, and improvisation under pressure. Above all, it proved that American morale in 1944 was not fragile in the way German commanders hoped. The Germans surrounded the 101st expecting to break it. What they got was a defense that refused to yield, and a pocket that held long enough for relief to arrive, turning the German timetable into German failure. If you want the end of this story to land with the weight it deserves, it should come back to the simplest truth. Bastogne was a crossroads, and crossroads decide wars because they decide movement. The Germans needed movement to win their gamble. The Americans needed time to survive it. In Bastogne, time was bought by men in foxholes and by tank destroyers ambushing armor, by artillery firing direct and by glider infantry holding thin lines, by engineers turned riflemen and by soldiers who answered surrender demands with contempt. The Germans believed that surrounding the 101st would end the problem. Instead, surrounding the 101st created the problem, because it trapped German resources around a town that refused to fall and gave Patton a target he could relieve. The Germans did not expect America to stand. Bastogne taught them that America could stand in the snow, surrounded, outnumbered, cut off from the sky, and still refuse to move.